Welcome to episode 71, Life Expansion After 50 podcast. Today we're talking about emotional modulation. So emotions are a fundamental part of the human experience, yet their true purpose and function are often misunderstood. This is an important step in the whole pre-stimulus-stimulus response cycle because it is the last line of defense before becoming triggered for an extended period of time and allowing that triggering to impact your business, your life, design, or whatever else might be important. Now, many people believe that emotions are meant to be dissected, dwelled upon, harbored indefinitely. However, this approach can lead to emotional stagnation and even psychological harm. Instead, emotions are best understood as energy in motion. Transient dynamic forces meant to flow through us. When this flow is blocked or interrupted, emotions can transform into entrenched feelings. Hold on a second. I just realized that I don't have. Okay, we're good. Now, emotions can transform into entrenched feelings, creating a cascade of neurobiological and psychological consequences. This foundational understanding forms the basis of emotional modulation and its role in achieving a life of expansion and purpose, particularly for those navigating life after 50. Now, when I say energy and motion, it's referring to the nature of emotions. Emotions are designed to move through us, like waves that rise and fall. When we allow this natural flow, the energy of an emotional charge dissipates, leaving us free to move forward. However, when this flow is obstructed through suppression, rumination, or avoidance, the emotional charge transforms into a static feeling. This shift is not just psychological, but also biochemical, creating neural pathways in the brain that become increasingly reinforced over time. Now, what's interesting is if we get in the habit of suppressing the unpleasant or negative emotions, that builds a habit of suppressing emotions in general, because remember, the subconscious is just associations. So an emotion comes up, the association fires, and it suppresses it. So it limits our ability to experience joy as well. Now, these wired pathways can fire with the slightest associations, causing what may describe as an anxiety spiral. This is why a seemingly minor stressor can sometimes escalate into a full-blown emotional crisis. Anxiety spirals pose a significant threat because they activate the body's fight or flight response. This response, while evolutionary advantageous for physical danger, is less helpful in modern context where the perceived threats are often psychological. Face it, how many times do we actually see a threat at the level of a Serengeti tiger? Now, and also we'll point out that I'm not talking, excuse me, I'm not talking about mental health here. This is strictly business. When I talk about anxiety, I'm talking about the kind of anxiety that comes up because we lose an account or we get some bad news. Something happens with an employee, a deadline is missed. So these psychological threats, because the subconscious doesn't discern, they can be treated the same way as a Serengeti tiger. And that is what causes the problem. So that's what this episode is about. It's about modulating the emotions, managing that process so that we don't get triggered and we're able to have our best self available to deal with the everyday things that we face. And once triggered, the fight or flight response overrides our ability to access higher order thinking, creativity, and problem solving. Instead, the subconscious dredges up past negative experiences, intensifying the perceived threat and creating a self-reinforcing loop. Breaking free from this cycle requires a conscious effort to modulate the emotion before it spirals out of control. The relationship between emotional modulation and operating above the line is that for those pursuing life expansion And that's what I'm talking about in this podcast, Life Expansion After 50. Emotional modulation becomes an indispensable skill. By definition, expanding one's life involves stepping into new, uncharted territory, a space I often refer to as operating above the line. And remember, the subconscious views the unfamiliar as a threat, and above the line is unfamiliar. So there will be more opportunities for perceived threats above the line. While this space offers immense opportunity for growth, I mean, we're in the land of infinite possibilities up there. It also comes with heightened awareness of risks. These risks, whether real or perceived, can feel more significant when operating at this level. Setbacks, it might be more public or impactful. This heightened perception of risk can lead to resistance, hesitancy, and even self-sabotage. However, as I often emphasize, the risks themselves are not new. They've always been present for the most part. What's new is our awareness of them. The reticular activating system, it goes both ways. It filters through and finds those things that are going to help us reach our goals, but it's also looking for things that might be threats. And that's why we do the positivity exercises. A few episodes ago, we do the positivity exercise so that we train the subconscious to scan for positive instead of its normal default to focus on survival, where everything can look like a tiger. But when you're focusing on, when you use the positivity exercise and you get it scanning for the greater positive context, many of those would-be threats dissolve into just the course of doing business. The key to navigating this space successfully lies in mastering the expanded stimulus response cycle, as I've been talking about. It's the process by which beliefs lead to actions. And there's, as I've laid out, 9 steps. This is the 9th of those. By conditioning ourselves to modulate emotions in the hyperfast cycle of the stimulus reactions section, which is the last 4, stimulus, reaction, response, and then action, we can limit the frequency and intensity of anxiety-inducing events in our personal and professional lives. The power of the pause is available to you in every step of these 2 phases. This pre-stimulus phase as well as the stimulus phase. The pause is our first line of defense in maintaining our agency. Personal leadership and agency is at the core of us being able to step into the life that we design. Without personal leadership and agency, we'll be knocked around by every wind, every impulse, every event. And with VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity increasing, the risks of falling into that increase. So we have to become better than our ancestors at dealing with external influences. And I often talk about, even in priming, I talked about shifting the power of priming from general to only 20% of our priming will come from external. The other 20%, 80%, the other 80% will come from internal. Now, it made sense in the hunter-gatherer days for the external environment to be 100% of the priming. You're walking around, you're doing hunting and gathering, you're hunting out there, you got tigers out there, and you walk into an open field. That open field primes you to look around. It primes you that there might be risks around. So it made sense for the external environment to be so powerful. But now, because we're being bombarded with things, we're online, we're on social media, we're being bombarded with things all the time. Some of them, most of them have nothing to do with what we're doing. Virtually zero to do with our goals, life design, dreams, ambitions, but yet they're still impacting us because they're going into the priming. So as we shift and move the priming to an internal focus rather than an external focus, now things like affirmations, incantations, your vision board, mind movies, these things, your internal state, these things will now be available to serve you more. It can also be employed anywhere along the cycle, making it available as the last line of defense. So emotional modulation is a tool that you can use anywhere, anytime. And I'll get into that when we get into the illustrations. When faced with a triggering event, the ability to pause, even for a fraction of a second, is a game changer. This pause interrupts the automatic reaction and creates space for a more intentional response. As I've discussed previously, the response is the what, the idea or intention to do something or take some action, while the action is the how, when, and with whom. It's it's the follow through. So during this pause between response and action, we may have to extend that pause. You can extend it up to 90 seconds, maybe a minute. We can modulate that emotional wave. Now, how do you do that? Up till now, I've been talking about pauses being measured in milliseconds, a quarter of a second, a half a second. But now with the emotional modulation, it could be about 90 seconds, a minute, maybe slightly less. You may have to excuse yourself if you can. If you can, I would say excuse yourself, or just say something like, you know what, I want to think about that before I respond. And that gives you some time. Now, depending on the magnitude of the potentially triggering event, you can run the modulation practice in the background, especially after you've done it a few times. If you've done it a few times, you're used to it, you've got some myelin built around it, and we'll talk about that. Now you can run it in the background without impacting your interaction. You could go on to the next point while you're running that in the background. Ideally, you can say, you know what, why don't we meet in about a half hour so we can talk about that? Then you go off, you do your emotional modulation. And the reason for doing this is we don't want to be caught in a triggered state when we're making important decisions. So, and rather than suppressing or controlling the emotion, as I mentioned, modulating allows us to sort of surf the wave, to ride through the crest of the emotional energy and let it naturally subside. If 90 seconds is not feasible, as I said, in the moment, consider verbally just delaying your response. For example, say, you know, let me think about it, or I'd like to consider other factors before responding. If possible, you can excuse yourself from the situation to engage in a modulation exercise. With practice, you can even perform this modulation exercise in the background of a conversation, subtly regaining emotional equilibrium without anyone noticing. Releasing stored negative feelings is an important activity because we can have feelings from decades also available to be triggered in a moment. Emotional modulation is not only valuable in the moment, but also as a daily practice. Over time, we accumulate negative feelings that, if left unaddressed, can sabotage our efforts and hinder our growth. These stored feelings create resistance to pursuing stretch goals, embracing self-actualization, leaning into our purpose. Regular practice of emotional modulation helps to release these pent-up emotions, clearing the way for personal and professional expansion. Just as I recommended practicing positivity exercises 3 times a day, perhaps conveniently tied to meals, I encourage you to incorporate emotional modulation into your daily practice. This practice builds the neural pathways, creating some myelin necessary for the habit to take hold. This makes them stronger, makes them last. Remember, myelin doesn't break, well, it breaks down over time with age, but it doesn't go away. The synapses is fluid, no pun intended. And so it flows away if you're not using that neural pathway. So what we're doing here, we're leveraging the synapse fluid moving to those neural pathways, but then the practice is what wraps the neuron with myelin, making them stronger, and that's what makes them last. Otherwise, your synapse will just move to the next focus. So remember, the first stage of habit formation involves that process, but this is only temporary. Without consistent practice, the pathway will fade, much like the temporary high after a seminar that fades without follow through. In fact, it's very difficult to follow through. Back to what I said last week, we make 30,000 decisions in a day, roughly every other second, assuming we're awake about 65,000 seconds. And so it's very difficult because now we're competing with all of those other stimulus that come into play, and we're constantly running these habit patterns. And that state of being, as I mentioned last week, becomes a habit. So by practicing modulation regularly, you not only build these pathways, but also reinforce them, making emotional modulation an automatic response in the heat of the moment. As we dive into the specifics of modulation, remember, this practice offers a double benefit. First, it trains you to handle triggering events more effectively in real time. And second, it helps you release long held emotional burdens, clearing the way for growth and expansion. This dual effect is why emotional modulation is not just a reactive tool, but a proactive strategy for living a more intentional life. And I'll talk about how you can combine the emotional modulation practice with the positivity exercise, thereby reinforcing that one as well and making it even more powerful. The likelihood of being triggered between having the positivity there, habits there is preventive, and by having the emotional modulation there as corrective, the likelihood of you experiencing a triggering event is reduced greatly. And you'll start to experience this within weeks, but it really, myelin building and all that, it's going to take you a year or so for it to really take hold and be strong. Remember, if you're 50 years old, you've been building strong habits since the 20s and making those habits a habit since the 30s roughly. It doesn't it's not a big price to pay if it takes you a year to reinstall or to rewire yourself for what you want to do with your own life design. So let's explore how to engage in this powerful practice. To help you remember the steps, I'll introduce two mnemonics as I go through this. So the first mnemonic I'll talk about is RAIN, RAIN. And these go together. So these go together. Hold on a second. Let's just get this organized. So RAIN, we're going to recognize the emotion. So this process is to keep you from suppressing the emotion. We first want to recognize it. And by recognizing it, we're acknowledging it. We're saying, yes, it's there. I'm not suppressing it. I'm experiencing it. The next thing we want to do is accept it. So now, we've acknowledged it. Now we're accepting it. We're not suppressing it. This is, again, we're not going to suppress the emotion. We're allowing it to happen. The next thing is investigate it. Now we're going to investigate the emotion so that we can learn from it. And this is along the lines of thinking that emotions are not there to cause us problems. They're there to teach us something so we can learn. And investigating it, by accepting it and then investigating it, we're able to learn from that emotion. And then this N is for nurture. And I think of it two ways. One is you take care of the nurturing that you have to do for yourself, taking a walk, taking some deep breaths, changing your venue where you are, looking around at some things, use some affirmations, mindfulness, but also nurture the process of learning. So, right, if you think about nurturing as developing, you're now allowing this learning to take hold. You're literally letting the synapse move to the neural pathways, and you practice it enough, you get myelin, but you're allowing yourself to learn from it, not just learn from it, but then embed the learning into yourself. So that's how I look at the nurture. Obviously, if you're working with an employee and they go through this, understand that they're going to need some support. And that nurture in that regard might just be, hey, let's take a walk, or why don't we get back to this, talk about it later on, ask them how things are going, maybe remind them of the positives that are going on in their life in their life. So as we recognize it, I mentioned two mnemonics, and it's actually going to be embedded in this one. As you recognize it, we want to locate it, because emotions, especially when we get into the dealing with existing emotions, they will be somewhere in your body. You'll notice where they are in your body. So locating it does a couple of things. It puts some separation between this idea of, oh my gosh, the house is falling, to let's intellectualize around this. It's an important step, because neuroscience tells us that the reason we suppress emotions, or want to suppress emotions in the first place, is because we don't want to experience the bodily sensation that comes with it. This rising intensity, maybe it's the cortisol staging and getting ready to go, or the adrenaline staging, getting ready to go, whatever that bodily sensation is with the emotion, we don't want that. And so by locating it, you're sort of like contextualizing it a bit. You're putting some pause time around it, where you can, instead of letting it just run its course, like they say, if you label something, you can manage it. That's the next step. So we're going to locate it, then we're going to label it. So these two together, locating it and labeling it, gives you a sense of, well, that's the modulation. I don't want to use the word control, because we're not controlling it. But what we're doing is we're putting it into perspective. We're putting the right perspective around it, putting the right frame around it, so that it becomes there to help us and not hurt us. And it's not there to hurt us, is that we interpret it in ways that end up hurting us. I'll show you that in a moment. And then we're going to learn from it. So we locate it, label it, and learn. That's the recognize, accept, and investigate. So you can use either of these: recognize, accept, investigate. I like locate, label, and learn, because it's something very quick. And if I'm working with someone else, I might be thinking recognize, accept, investigate. But when I'm working with myself and self-coaching, it's locate, label, learn. It's quick 3 steps. That's how I look at the two of those being different. Now, if you, in the label it, there are 8. This is by Joan Rosenberg. Her book is 90 Seconds to a Life You Love. I recommend you reading or listening to that book. And she goes through this idea of the 8 unpleasant emotions. She makes a big point around, they're not negative emotions, they're unpleasant emotions, because we want to get to the point where emotions are there to teach us something. And it allows us to experience the joyful emotions as well as the unpleasant ones. And the unpleasant ones are the ones that create that bodily sensation that makes us want to run from them. If we suppress it, we end up suppressing the positive emotions as well. And those 8 emotions: sadness, shame, frustration, anger, embarrassment, vulnerability, disappointment, and helplessness. The reason why she takes it to these 8 is what she has said is that if you take all the emotions, all the unpleasant emotions that we can experience, they come down to these 8. If you don't do this, you have the risk of hundreds of emotions that you could be experiencing, and it is so easy for that to get out of control. And because many of these unpleasant emotions can trigger anxiety, that becomes our catch-all word. So if you think about yourself, which one of these actually are going to create more anxiety? I think everybody's different, but think of it in terms of anxiety and what you're going to do about it. When anxiety is coming from 100 potential sources, there's nothing that works. The more you try to suppress the anxiety, the bigger it gets, et cetera, right? But when you label it sadness, okay, maybe you're not going to have anxiety around sadness. It's not certainly the anxiety that there's some threat that's going to come. It's already happened. It's a different response. Shame. Now, this one might have something to do with the future. You might be concerned that it's possible. You might be concerned that it's possible that this shame might lead to something else. So that one might be tied to anxiety. Frustration, it's probably already done, unless you're concerned about something in the future. My point is, all of these don't necessarily lead to anxiety. So this is it's a start of managing that. But the more important thing is you're labeling it. That's the point. You're going to label it with one of these 8. We're only talking about unpleasant emotions. Obviously, there's a lot more that are positive, but you want to force label it into one of these 8. And I guess in an extreme circumstance, you can maybe do a blend, but I would prefer to just, which one are you really feeling? And the reason is this. The reason is because when we experience an emotion, we're going along, and in today's world, especially in business, we're between social media and all the stuff hitting us and advertising, and a lot of advertising is built to create fear and anxiety. We're already at a heightened state, which is why this is important. We want to start taking that whole thing down. It's like having a constantly turned down temperature. But what happens is we get the event. And in this case, it would be, the pre-stimulus is ongoing. I talked about the 30. The reason I say 33 is because if you Google it, it says 33,000, but just for sake of speaking, I'd like to say 30,000. If you have 30,000 decisions in a day, it's like one every other second. Those are actually stimulus response cycles, and they're literally layering on one another. It's like one is not even finished before the next one is starting. So you got these, and this is why your state of being becomes habitual. And it's also difficult because where do you intervene with those 30,000 decisions? And so in the context of the stimulus response part of the cycle, we have the stimulus, the reaction, the response, and then the action. And between the response and the action, we do a pause. And that's why I was talking last week. You can have your conscious mind pull information out of the subconscious. And this happens in milliseconds. So it's a very powerful tool. I did an exercise to help the audience experience what that feels like when you're pulling information from the subconscious. And in that pause, you may recognize that this is something that I can't manage. So the way we've set up the stimulus response cycle is that the positivity exercise gets us that between stimulus and reaction, that 1 to 200 millisecond time frame, very, very quick. We're conditioning in the scan for positivity, or for the greater positive context. Just by doing that, you're going to have much fewer instances of triggering events. But let's say one does get through. Now we're starting to feel the emotion. This is the bodily sensation that comes up. The bodily sensation starts to rise. And as it rises, the knee-jerk reaction is to suppress. If we suppress, I'll talk about what happens in a moment. If we suppress, it continues. But if we allow it to go, that bodily sensation only lasts 90 seconds. This is an important point, because if the reason it's so uncomfortable is because of the bodily sensation, and the bodily sensation only lasts 90 seconds, if we can just get through the bodily sensation, we're in a much better place. Joan Rosenberg one of her examples, she said a client would just say 90 seconds, 90 seconds, 90 seconds, 90 seconds. But this is the part I was talking about. You can run this in the background. So let's look at it like this. You have an event. And in the context of the stimulus response cycle, this event would actually be the response. This is the response step. Because remember, the stimulus response, this is happening in less than a second. So you have stimulus, reaction, response. So this is like the reaction, the response all rolled into one, where you're getting this triggering, potential trigger. So this event leads to an emotion. And this emotion can create, it's energy and motion, but if we let it ride, it can turn into a feeling. And once it turns into a feeling, it's a lot harder to modulate it. When it's energy and motion, it's just flowing through. Once you stop it, that's when the cortisol starts to come into play. The bodily sensation is the preparing. This is me saying, it's not the neuroscience terminology. The bodily sensation is likely the preparing for the cortisol. And because you've experienced it before, you know what comes next some of the time. But because you're now going to do the label, locate, learn, instead of harboring and dwelling on it, you're going to move forward. So now the next thing that happens, we've got the emotion. We're going to go through the processing of it. We do some mindfulness stuff, and then we're back on track. So this is how we want to do it. If we don't modulate this process, so what we have is the event. So you can look at it like this, right? Coming down, it's like one under the other. Then the emotion happens. The bodily sensation begins to form and crest. And this is, I talk about surfing the wave. You surf the wave to the crest, you get over it, it subsides on the other side, and now you're able to take action. So back to the stimulus response, this is action. This is where we can take action, because we are now not being triggered. We don't want to take action in a triggered state. You want to get back to stasis before taking that action. And that's how this looks. That's when you do the 90 seconds. And since the bodily sensation only lasts 90 seconds, you just have to get past it. And you can run that in the background. This is that, I said the action step was do it, delay it, delegate it, dump it. This would be the delay. You're delaying it for at least 90 seconds. But I think if it's a potentially triggering event, I would just, whoever you're talking to, just agree to meet with them later. Here's what it can look like if you don't do that. It comes up, and while this one would have been going down, right? Another one is created. And while this one should be going down, another one is created. And these are all bodily sensations. And now you can see what's going on. You can see why this can turn into an anxiety spiral, because as it does this, it's pulling in feelings from the past. All these other feelings from years past can start piling on. And next thing, this small little event is now taking on this magnitude of something major. And we've seen this happen to people when they get triggered. And the longer they stay in it, it just grows and grows and grows. This is when there's a terminology people say you got to get out of your head, because when you're in your head, it's just rah, 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 rah. And we want to be able to stop that. Now, what we talked about the positivity exercise, and the positivity exercise, just for recap, remember what you want to do is you want to identify this is the practice part. Identify, in this case, it'll be an unpleasant emotion. You're going to go through the process of label it, locate it, label it, learn from it. And then we talked about the RAIN model being having that nurture step. What we're going to do for the nurture step is look for and identify. You're going to find the greater positive context. You're going to find the greater positive context. I've used the example of if you get a flat tire, that could be an annoyance, and you may go into this state of, I'll use the word anxiety. Maybe you're going to be late for your meeting, etc. Rather than allowing the emotion to take off and start running around the flat tire, because it's manageable. It's going to take you X amount of time to change it or X amount of time for a tow truck. But we've trained now the subconscious to automatically find and reflect on the greater positive context. The greater positive context is that you have a car. In other words, if you didn't have a car, you couldn't have a flat tire. Or having a flat tire is just part of owning a car. But since owning a car was a goal, the subconscious doesn't look at it as a threat. This is something you wanted. It's not the tiger. You wanted the car. The flat tires come with the car. That's the greater positive context. It doesn't put it into threat category. It just moves on. That's the positivity exercise. You can go back a few episodes and get that. But now I'm incorporating it with the emotional modulation, because we have these past emotions from years past. And while you're doing the positivity exercise, or start it again if you've already gone through the 6 weeks, again, 3 times a day, 90 seconds, we're just adding on this step of finding emotions that have been unpleasant. And you're practicing going through the RAIN model. Recognize it, accept it, investigate it, so you can learn from it, and then nurture. And the nurture step would be finding the greater positive context and feeling good about that. This is where you're building myelin around that process. So now we have 2 things that are going to be built in at the subconscious level: the positivity, which helps the subconscious scan for the positive, and then we have the RAIN model, which conditioning in, so it becomes habitual. When it happens in milliseconds, that's why I said you can run it in the background. It's going to automatically allow the body. Now, the bodily sensations, that's going to take you the 90 seconds. But because you've practiced it over and over and over, it's almost like the 90 seconds just happen in the background. You don't even worry about it. You're not freaking out about it, because it's just a bodily sensation. It's physiology. It's not mental. It's not going to turn into a spiral because you're not trying to suppress it. You're not focusing on it. You're letting it run its course, 90 seconds. And meanwhile, you're also looking for the greater positive context. And now you can see the opportunity, because remember, every cloud has a silver lining. You can't have a breakthrough without having a break with. So these doors being closed means that some other door is opening. So whatever's coming our way, it's creating a situation that what may not have been available to us in the past is available now. So that's that process that's going to happen. Now, I talk about it it's an expanded way. It takes me 30 minutes to say that, but it can happen in seconds. And when this closes that loop from that whole conditioning process, pre-stimulus and stimulus. And last week we ended it with action. But now we have this extra point there that says if it's a triggering event, then we're going to do the modulation. So this actually comes before action step, between response and action, once you get used to it. I didn't want to talk about it last week because since we're doing the other steps, the likelihood of you having a triggering event is greatly reduced. So again, just to recap, you're going along, you have your event that leads to an emotion. And that leads to a positive action. Meanwhile, we have this bodily sensation going on. And we can let that run in the background. Remember, the action, I said we can do it, delay it, delegate it, dump it. And this delay could be the 90 seconds that's needed if you're going through that bodily sensation. But the way I'm talking about it now is you can let this bodily sensation run in the background while you're just asking questions. And that way you let it process. You've already conditioned that you're going to find the positive context, the greater positive context. You can literally just start asking more questions about it. And as you ask questions, it's going to contextualize this particular event and make distinctions between this event and some other random event from that long list of anxiety producing experiences that you may have had in your life. And again, with the bodily sensation, we don't want to let that turn into another bodily sensation and another one, because this cycle will keep continuing. And that's how I see an anxiety spiral occurring. Right. So that is it. We are going to start talking about the dynamic leadership. I'll go through a series with that. In the first one, I'll spend 3 episodes on the sales framework for an entrepreneur. And the reason I'm going to be doing that is because as you step into life expansion, it could lead to you wanting to have some kind of a service, some kind of a business, something that you're doing where you're providing for others. And that's going to require some level of selling. There are many people who've had a successful career, but they've decided at some point in their life that they didn't want to sell. And selling has been this thing off to the side that they just don't want to deal with. It's become a bigger and bigger barrier. So I'm going to provide a framework that works for entrepreneurs, it works for CEOs, presidents. It would work for salespeople too, but the point is, salespeople have a presentation that they're following. If you're selling your company to be the idea to investors, or you're selling a candidate on taking a position with you, or you're selling a supplier on different terms, we have to have a framework with it that we're using to sell from. And so, and as the entrepreneur, you will be selling your services directly to the user, whether it's B2B or B2C. There will be times, even if you have salespeople, there will be times where you're that salesperson. But in the beginning, you may not have salespeople, and so you are the salesperson. So we need a framework that works no matter what, and it's going to work at all these levels. So I'll spend at least 3 episodes on that one, because what I want to do is lower the barriers to life expansion. If you talk to somebody off the street and say, hey, what do you feel about life expansion at 60 years old? I know I'm saying 60. Most of them they're done with it. They've tried the things. It's not available to them. They've given up on it. I don't want to deal with it anymore. So as we can break down each of those walls, each of those barriers, and one of them is going to be the big domino. And when that big domino falls, I say, you know what? I can do this. And that's where I want to get us. So we'll see you next week. Actually, I probably will we'll go into 2025. If I do go on next week, it'll be a high level, so you're not going to miss anything. All right, we'll talk to you next time.